Hello again. We are here with the skeletal system today. For this particular chapter, we're going to focus on the axial skeleton. Let's get started. Alright, so the human skeletal system is broken into two divisions, the axial and appendicular skeleton. The axial containing 80 bones, the appendicular containing 126. So of those 80 axial bones, they include the skull bones, auditory ossicles, those small little ear bones, the hyoid bone, ribs, sternum, and bones of the vertebral column. So anything in the center of the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton, they include the bones of the upper and lower limbs and the girdles that hold them to the axial skeleton. So your arms and legs. Here is a quick picture of the divisions here. The blue will be the axial. The yellow tinted will be the appendicular. Alright, some types of bones that we'll see throughout the skeletal system are going to be long, short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid. We will see some surface markings. Most of them will be either depressions or openings or processes. So depressions are just going to be a small indent on the bone itself. An opening obviously will be a passageway for different tissues. Processes are projections off of the bone, and these will be attachment points for ligaments and tendons. Alright, so we will also see some particular types of bones that are also a type of category of marking sometimes. So sutural bones, these are going to be small formed bones between the sutures of the skull bones here. They are not necessarily normal or abnormal. Sometimes they are a variation. So the reason why they're called sutural bones is because they're not supposed to actually be present. It's just an area of calcification in the membrane before the regular skull bones are able to form in that area. Okay, sutures are going to be the areas that join the skull bones together. Fissures are going to be narrow slits between bones for passages. Foramen. We will see several foramen, so do pay attention to these. This large one that we see here, that is a terrible circle. That is the foramen magnum. This is where the spinal cord exits the skull. Okay, and we'll see a couple more later on. Fossas are shallow depressions. We'll see a few of these. So mandibular fossa, this is where the mandible or the lower jaw articulates. Sulcus is going to be a furrow or another narrow passageway. Meatus, we mostly focus on the external auditory meatus, so this is for the ear canal, if you will. Condyle, so a rounded projection. A facet, we mostly see these in the vertebral column, so we'll see a superior and inferior facet on all the vertebrae, or most of them. The head of a bone is going to be an attachment point, so articulation will take place there, and the neck is going to be just on the other side of that head. Okay, a crest, prominent ridge, we see this one here on the sacrum. One that we mostly talk about will be the iliac crest, and we'll find those here at the top of the pelvic bone. Okay, epicondyles, they are above the condyle, so we see those on the humerus and the femur. A line, long narrow ridge for attachment of muscle. Spinous process on the vertebra. Okay, trochanter. very large projection only on the femur. So whenever you are feeling for your hip, that large bony prominence, you are actually feeling the greater trochanter. Tubercle, we see these as variable size projections, more rounded most of the time. The main ones are going to be on the humerus, greater and lesser trochanters, or tubercle. And then a tuberosity is just a variable size projection, so usually rough and bumpy. Alright, the skull itself, we have 22 bones. These are not including the 3 middle ear bones. And then we have a number of processes and different depressions and foramen that we'll talk about, but there will be a few key markings that I'll have you focus on. So, for the skull, looking at the bones to begin with, this blue bone here is going to be the frontal bone. So this is the first flat bone of the skull that we're looking at. Okay, you can see here it occupies the superior portion of the orbital sockets. This big yellow bone here makes up the majority of the front of the face, is going to be the maxilla. And the lower jaw is going to be the mandible. Okay, the orange bone will be one you need to know. This is the zygomatic bone. We're not really going to focus on the smaller bones, such as the nasal and lacrimal bones. We do see the vomer here. This makes up the inferior portion of the nasal septum. These little orange areas in the middle of the nose are going to be part of the ethmoid bone. We'll see the middle nasal concha and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. This is going to make up the superior portion of that nasal septum. Another bone that we will see in different pictures here will be the sphenoid bone. It is this green bone at the posterior portion of the orbital sockets. And that is the majority of the front of the skull. Okay, a lateral view here over on the right side. Again, at the bottom we have the mandible. The yellow is the maxilla, orange is zygomatic, blue is frontal. And then here we see some of that sphenoid bone. You can see it's rather large actually, so we reach all the way from the left to the right side of the skull. And then here we have the parietal bone. So this is going to be the second flat bone of the skull. Now we have two of these, a left and a right, just the same as the temporal bone, another flat bone of the skull. We have a left and a right. And then back here, this lighter orange is going to be the occipital bone. Okay, so a few key features of the temporal bone are going to be the zygomatic arch, or zygomatic process that is helping form the zygomatic arch with the zygomatic bone. Then the external auditory meatus. And here we have the mastoid process. So this is that kind of bony lump you feel posterior inferior of the ear. Okay, here is a sagittal view. We see the internal auditory meatus right here. We see some of the inner workings of the sphenoid bone. And then again, this is the ethmoid bone. So this is that perpendicular plate. Here is the vomer bone. We see the internal of the maxilla. This is going to be the palatine bone, but we don't focus on that too much. And then the occipital bone. Okay, a posterior view here. We see both parietal bones. The occipital, again, orange. At the inferior portion of that is where we see that foramen magnum that I was talking about, where the spinal cord exits the skull. From this view, the inferior view, we see that foramen magnum much better. Here we see some occipital condyles where we will see the first cervical vertebra articulating. Okay, from here there are a few couple more foramen that we want to focus on. The carotid and jugular foramen are also found on the temporal bone. So carotid right here, and then jugular. So carotid is going to be for the passageway of the carotid artery. Jugular foramen will be for passage of the jugular vein. Okay, the superior view, we see the sphenoid bone, much larger here, the ethmoid bone, and the other flat bones of the skull.